Hello everyone and welcome to our next Paddock talk, which is terrific. I'm Belinda Hazel from Tasmanian Women in Agriculture, and I'm delighted to introduce to you all Dr. Polly McGee. I'll go through a bit of an introduction and then hand over to Polly, and fingers crossed the technology will work in our favour, and then we'll have a great opportunity to have a Q&A session with Polly following her presentation. So please pop some questions on the Q&A in the chat box so we can have a really great conversation. So Dr. Polly McGee is an author, digital strategist, leadership facilitator and disruptor-for-good. I really like that. With over a decade working in innovation and commercialisation in public, university and private sector roles and leadership program design and delivery for diverse businesses. Polly has a strong background in combining coaching, facilitating, teaching, curriculum design and content authoring to create the business cultures of the future. She's a sought after speaker and MC, so we're going to have some great time with you, Polly, in relation to that. And she brings the skills of interviewing and listening with empathy and humour to stages large and small. She's the author of The Good Hustle, a blueprint for building ethical values driven for purposes and business models that are profitable and sustainable. Polly writes at the intersection of mind, leadership and spirituality. She's passionate about inspiring curious, resilient, well-rounded humans through wholeheartedly incorporating growth mindset, values, mindfulness and other skills around social and ethical and emotional learning into all aspects of our lives. She's an experienced board member with a focus on commercialisation and business development of not-for-profit, for-purpose businesses. And I love your tagline there, Polly, all-purpose human being. I think that is fantastic. So I will have my way with this technology. I shall share the screen, if I can. That should work now. See how you go.
Yay! Belinda, you're doing an amazing job, particularly reading out that bio, which I've just realised is the most reader-unfriendly thing ever. Which is kind of why I moved to just having all-purpose human being, because it just seemed a lot easier to describe as what I did. Just all-purpose. I'm so happy to have everyone here today, although it's weird to not be able to see everyone, so I'm just imagining you're there in your agricultural female glory. So thank you for your time. We're going to have time for questions at the end. If anything is really confusing to you, please jump in and ask a question, but I'm just going to push on with this, and then when we get to the end I'm going to give about 15 minutes for us to have some time together just to ask questions. So I was really excited when Women in Agriculture asked me to present at Paddock Talk, because agriculture and women in business are two of my great loves, and certainly I absolutely got my break in my career when I was working in innovation and agriculture, and those two things together are two of my great passions. And I also found my way to Tasmania when I was working in an agricultural innovation program, so I'm incredibly grateful for having that visit down here and falling in love with the place and pretty much moving and never leaving. So thanks to Ag and thanks to women for all of the good things in my life. So we're going to have a chat today about resilience, and I think now is a really good time to talk about it. I feel it's almost, taking coals to Newcastle to talk to women in agriculture about resilience, because if ever you wanted to find a more resilient group of people, it's the incredible women who are running and supporting and mainstays of agricultural businesses. So I know you guys can probably write the book on resilience, but I think that in a world where we use the term really frequently now, some of the meaning of it's becoming lost. And so I wanted to just really remind everyone what it is that resilience is and give you a set of tools to be able to use to think about resilience in a new way. So it's going to be hopefully helpful to you if you're having a difficult time, if you're really feeling that you've got to a bit of a peak low of resilience. And today, hopefully, we can perk that all back up again. So I think about resilience not so much as the tough part, the stoic part. I think about it absolutely as the soft and vulnerable part, where it's the time that is taken from when we hit the ground to when we bounce back again. Resilience is asking of us that we are going to encounter hardship. and because you can't have resilience without having something to become resilience from. So resilience actually gives us the delicious delight of life, which sounds crazy because resilience is always seen as that thing which is really hard. However, without having that smorgasbord of experience to draw from, we can't build the blocks to get ourselves through every part of our lives. So resilience is the capacity to bounce back emotionally, physically, psychologically, and economically. It doesn't mean that no hardship will befall us. What it means is that when it does, we'll be able to deal with it. So what resilience isn't is easy or painless. So you will not experience the capacity to develop your resilience muscles without suffering trauma, which is kind of, as I said, it's a paradox of what makes us the best people in the world, but also makes us people who have had to go through suffering. It will involve distress. And again, anyone who's been on the land in any part of Australia, you know the cycles of distress that come with that commitment to growing and that commitment to being part of agriculture. More than any other group, people in this sector are so connected to the vicissitudes of land and weather and the things that really can't be controlled. And one of the lessons of resilience for people in agriculture is certainly around the idea of being able to just surrender to what they can't control. It's very difficult to be resilient when you need to have control over everything. So really understanding those lessons of what it is we can control, what it is we can't control, and the one thing in everything that we have the capacity to control is the way we react. That is probably the only thing we actually have the capacity to control, is how we react to every situation. And so this, as I said, is going to be a journey through looking at some of the ways we can better nuance our reactions. So who's resilient if we look across all of the people, all of the time? Resilience isn't something which is bestowed on certain people. It's not a gene-based thing. We don't have a society where, those people are resilient and those people are really weak. Everyone can be resilient. It's not an extraordinary thing. It is a practice. And if it's very much like a muscle. If you think about how a muscle develops, to actually grow muscles, you need to tear them. And in the repair of the muscle, the growth happens. You couldn't get a better metaphor for what it is to be resilient. So we all get to be resilient, but we have to develop the habits of resilience. So as I said, I really haven't met many people from agricultural sector who I didn't think were incredibly resilient, because it is the nature of the beast. But there's a set of habits which I like to think are the habits which really give us better skills at being resilient and really build all of those muscles. And so I guess when we often hear sort of the millennial generation talked about as a generation that's really non-resilient, I would argue that they're a generation that haven't been given a lot of practice in being resilient. And so, again, if you have a group of you have kids that you're thinking, not so strong in the world, again, probably not rural kids, they, like everyone, they just need the practice of developing the muscles. And it's really exciting to think about that, because the more we become resilient, the more we develop that capacity to bounce back. And COVID has been really schooling the whole world in what it is to suffer and to have to adapt to incredibly ever-changing situations that we've never experienced before. This is the absolute place where the diamonds are made. So we're very much in a global place of resilience building right now. But there are 6 habits that we can develop that will really give us the tools that we need and the muscles we need to be resilient. One of the ways that we're able to stay the course of what we're doing is to be really clear on our macro goals. What I mean by that is that we know our purpose and we know what we're looking towards in our businesses. So anything that comes along, we might have to adapt the way we're going to get to that long horizon, but we know it's there and we know what it is. And again, I think in many rural businesses, this is something which is really in the heartland. People know why they're on the land. They know why they're doing the work they're doing, whatever part of agriculture you're in. So you're clear on what it is you're trying to deliver in the world. When you have that laser light focus, it means that you don't get distracted by other things. Vicissitudes will come and go, but you know what's at the end. You know your baseline values and purpose. You know why you're in the game. You know what gets you up in the morning. You know what it is that makes you feel like you have meaning and worth in your life. And that is something that you, in the midst of any kind of chaos, can come back to. It is absolutely your North Star, and it allows you to be able to sort of bounce back. If you think about values as being one of those blow-up dolls with a resilience as being like those blow-up dolls, and you can smack them and they hit the ground and they bounce back up again. Having a really strong understanding of values and purpose gives you that baseline. And that's really the reason that any of us are in the world. I say in my introduction that I work at the intersection of curiosity and leadership and spirituality. And spirituality often is kind of an odd thing to bring into leadership work that I do or to the business work that I do. But for me, spirituality is the absolute understanding of the meaning of life, why you're there, why your values and purpose are so important, because it allows everything else to make sense if you know what you're doing. So it's really important, if you haven't really sat down for a while and thought about what it is that makes you you, what it is that gives you meaning, that gets you out of bed come rain or bushfire or hail or drought or pestilence or whatever it is that's in your face on that day. Values and purpose are the things that are going to bring you back. Keeping a loose grip and remaining agile is so crucial. And agile, like resilience and mindfulness, they're words, and unprecedented that we've had just bandied around continually over these last few months. And, you know, previously when the bushfires were happening, when everything else is happening. But being agile means that we are able to move quickly, and we are able to change our minds, we're able to change our positions, we're able to change our strategy without clinging onto something that is no longer serving us. So to be able to bounce, we need to be able to have the loosest grip possible. So this is where we can have a really strong anchor with our goals and our purpose. We can have a really strong anchor with our horizon of what it is that we're setting out to do. But the path there, we don't really need to know it. So therefore we can be agile, and we can be truly agile, which is to be able to think quickly, be curious, and move. When we talk about resilience, we don't often talk about emotion. So, as poor Belinda was made to read out at great length in my introduction, one of the things I do is I work in leadership, and the leadership work I specifically train in is Brené Brown's Dare to Lead work. If you aren't familiar with her work, she's really pioneered this idea in leadership, that leadership is heart-centered, and that to be a really strong, courageous leader, you need to be vulnerable and you need to embrace emotion, which is something that we don't often think about with leaders. We think that, you know, leaders are really strong and they don't have any fear, but the research that she's done, and there's a great amount of it, she's got over 400,000 pieces of data to support her work, says that unless we embrace emotion and unless we fully lean into what our vulnerability is, we aren't able to be courageous, because there is no courage without vulnerability. What that means is that we have to acknowledge what we're feeling, which is often hard to do, because so much of the time we're asked to be so strong and to be so capable, and to do that not just for ourselves, but often for our communities and our families and our family businesses and our intergenerational people that are around us. But we are feeling things like stress, like anxiety, like grief, heartache. We're feeling shame. One of the least talked about emotions, but one of the emotions which most fundamentally drives our behaviour. In the work of Brené Brown, we can't have a conversation about courage or vulnerability without having a conversation about shame. And shame drives so much of fear and anger. So these feelings are very present, particularly when we are in situations that are uncertain. I mean, this is the definition of vulnerability. It's a time which is uncertain and unable to be predicted and emotionally vulnerable. Now, I think that pretty much describes COVID, pretty much describes being in an agricultural business. So unless we're able to understand when we are triggered by emotion, when we feel emotion in our bodies, what happens just before that, what happens during, and what are the behaviours that come with us after that, we are much better at being able to weather the reactive storm. So when I said at the beginning, the one thing we can control is how we react. The things that make us react are unresolved shame, fear, guilt, anxiety. When we are able to work through those emotions and recognize them, it makes us much better at being able to just clearly and calmly deal with what's right in front of us. Resilience absolutely asks us to be present. So this is why when we talk about resilience, we often bring in mindfulness and those kind of things which are asking us to not be sort of constantly ricocheting like a little pinball between what happened before, what's going to happen in the future, I don't know, I'm getting really anxious, boom, 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 I'm up and down, and now I'm suddenly in full-blown anxiety, fight or flight, heightened emotions, can't do anything. So if you ever get those kind of feelings, what we need to do is that we recognize that we've been triggered by emotion, and that we are then moving to a place where we won't be having any rational thoughts happening. We've got very primitive brains. Although they're highly effective in thinking, they're really designed to keep us safe. So the minute we get into a situation of emotional uncertainty or anything that might trigger a fear-based response in us, boom, what happens? We go straight into fight, flight, or freeze. When we're in those flood of emotions and those flood of hormones, our bodies are only being designed to do three things. They're not being designed to rationally think about a problem and solve it. So understanding that we are triggered by emotion and that it fundamentally causes us to have an inability to respond well is really important, because what that means is then we can step out of decision making, we can step out of conversations, we can just simply give ourselves the recognition that we're upset and that we need to nurture ourselves as we would a child that would come to you that was sobbing or that would be upset or frightened. What would you do? You wouldn't say, come on, get up, keep going. You'd say, come and sit with me. Let me give you a gentle pat. Let me make it all right. We're just going to sit together while you feel this. So feeling our emotions as they happen, absolutely essential to resilience. Having a big emotional vocabulary, not just mad, sad, or glad, but really being able to dig into the nuance of how you're feeling. This is one of the ways that we can become resilient and resistant to having those big crashes. And no stoicism. We have moved beyond the era of everyone having a stiff upper lip and just taking it all on the chin. We've moved into a place where we need to be able to ask for what we need. We need to be able to ask for help. And we need to be able to really understand that vulnerability is a team sport. You can't do it alone. You can't go vulnerability alone and just try it out and see if it works. And it is the thing that will bring people more close to you. It will give you better and more open relationships, because the minute you show vulnerability and you ask for help, you're giving permission for other people to also take down their armor and start to become softer. And being soft means we can have a soft front, we can be led by our hearts, but we can have a really strong, firm back to be able to stand strong during all of this. Taking perspective is also super important, because for all of those reasons, particularly being heightened emotion is a really important thing to understand how much it subconsciously plays out in our lives all the time. And for many of us, if we're in situations where we're constantly in a heightened state of awareness and in that sort of cortisol jammed on, stress hormones all jammed on, adrenaline jammed on, we often don't recognize that that's how we're actually living our lives day to day, waiting for the next disaster to unfold. It's incredibly fatiguing on the body. It's incredibly fatiguing on our resources and our resilience, and it's very difficult to get perspective. What we do know about anything in our lives that is causing us stress or causing us to suffer is that it's going to pass. We need to be able to take perspective on that this is something that's happening right now, and in the present we can acknowledge it, but we need to be able to let it go. We need to be able to move through how we thought things should be. So when we cling on to the belief of the way some situation should play out, or how a deal will play out, or how a crop's going to go, whatever it is, when we hang on to a belief that we have created for ourselves, we're working in the territory of fiction, because we simply can't control the stuff that's going on around us. It is the greatest myth of humans that we have the power to do anything more than just deal with how we actually react. When we're able to say, oh, I observed that didn't go as I thought it would. What's next? Let me get curious about why. Let me start to investigate this rather than just trying to push it back into the shape you wanted it to be. It really limits our capacity to recover, because we can't be agile when we're in a fixed mindset about what should happen. And we can spend a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of emotion in the shoulds of, but I wanted it to be like this. I thought my life would be like this. I thought this relationship would be like this, whatever it is. So recognizing that we can't control that. And so then we can just look to, well, what's another way to approach this? What's another way to come around it? Working again with curiosity is a really critical part of becoming more resilient, but also just having less investment in what we believe are the really permanent things of life. And as we know, there's nothing that's permanent or real for us except death, birth, and the reality of the taxes. We need to think really big and really long term with our goals, and I talked about that a little bit at the beginning in terms of what is that horizon that we're looking to do. The perspective is that whatever's happening is one of the pieces of the puzzle on the way to getting to that goal. If you don't have an expectation beyond a loose framework of what you would like to happen, it's much easier to be agile and to remember what those goals are and keep coming back to them and not getting stuck and really dug in the things that aren't going right, to look at the perspective of what is sort of going right, what is going in a way that you didn't think. How can we talk about failure in a way that doesn't feel like it's loss or it's shameful, that feels like it's curious and investigative? Welcoming the unknown and identifying the truth is the final part of taking perspective, which is that we have to have what Brene Brown would call gritty facts and gritty faith, which is to say that we're really present and aware of what the actual truth of our situation is. We're not Pollyannaing it. We're not just trying to make it all hardcore optimism, but recognizing that there will be some optimistic moments, and there possibly also will be some stuff that is difficult and isn't what you wanted. Welcoming the unknown only can happen when you're coming from a place of curiosity and vulnerability, because, back to that definition, vulnerability is about the inability to control the situation, the emotion, and the emotional exposure. So when you can be vulnerable and courageous at the same time, and understanding that fear is an integral part of that, we can be really afraid and we can be the most courageous people on earth. We can welcome the unknown in a way that isn't terrifying and doesn't send us into that traditional fight, flight, or freeze. We can welcome the unknown with curiosity, with a bit of anticipation, and we can understand that we have the capacity to spectacularly fail and get back up again, because that's what resilience is. If we were better in our culture at failing and better at talking about failure and sharing it and not making it something which was a solo, alone and shameful activity, it would be much easier for us all to be a more resilient culture, because we would just see it for what it is, another great learning experience, and on we go. One of the things that I see people do really well is talk about all the terrible things they've done and all of the ways that they haven't succeeded. One of the things I see people do very badly is bank success. And success doesn't have to be banked at the point at which you actually pull off that incredible thing you wanted to achieve. It's all the little things that you manage to do. Resilience, very much like trust, is built in the really small moments. Resilience doesn't happen after one great wrenching tear. If you think about the muscle analogy, if you just ripped your muscle open, you'd be in recovery for months, if not years. Little tiny tears, little tiny moments, it was what builds our resilience. Being able to see them for what they are, take perspective, understand our place, feel the emotion, and then keep on going with optimism and joy and happiness and community. That's kind of what resilience should look like. So celebrating all the small things might just be celebrating that you got to the end of a day because it felt like you wouldn't when you were hitting lunchtime. And it might be that like one small thing worked well. And that's a really great thing to do. I think we often don't do that because sometimes we don't feel like celebrating, particularly in these sort of COVID times when so many people are having a really difficult time. And so we tend to just not put ourselves out there. And also, I think culturally in Australia, and certainly in rural Australia, we often do that thing where we don't want to be seen to be, you know, bigger than our britches or booming ourselves up. So people really play down the incredible things they do. I can't tell you the number of amazing business people I've spoken to when you've seen them just do something that, particularly in Tasmania, no one else has ever done before. And it's like, oh, that old thing, yeah, I just threw it together with a couple of bits that were in the shed as they're winning their innovation award. You know, so our capacity to really sort of play it down, it doesn't serve us, because it's really good to say, hey, I did this and I feel really proud about it and I want everyone to pile in and celebrate. So find ways to celebrate not only your small successes, but everyone else's as well. Really get in there and become a champion and an advocate for saying, hey, you're doing an amazing job. I saw what you did. I saw how you showed up, and I'm really excited about that. And I really celebrate you and thank you. And it helped me. That starts us having conversations with each other that not only bring in celebration, but also bring in vulnerability, and you know, that we let other people know that their small wins, the way they show up, the way we see them, it makes us feel good. And I'm not talking about those Facebook posts that are kind of like, look at my perfect life, my Instagram filter. I'm talking about the real gritty, actual successes and ways that we show up that we can maybe not, we don't maybe talk about as much as we can, but it's a really beautiful thing to be able to say to someone, hey, I see you and I see what you do and you're amazing. Leveraging failure, I mentioned it briefly in the previous slide. We have to understand how to make failure a space to become curious. And certainly in the technology world, where I've done a lot of work with fast growth startups, you can't be in a startup without failing. It's absolutely integral to being able to take whatever it is you're trying to do in an innovation sense from where you start to a place where it's actually workable. That doesn't happen if you can't fail, because you can't ever iterate what you're doing without making a mistake or failing or messing it up. When you're in cultures where that is really celebrated and it's a matter of like, okay, this happened, everyone's very transparent about it, we can straight away get in there and have an analysis and really look and see what went well, what didn't go well, what can we do better next time, without straight away going to, well, that's your fault because you fucked that up. Now, that's a culture which is so unproductive, because what it does is it makes people really hide away from the things that they've made mistakes in. And, you know, we're human. We all make mistakes all the time. So being able to be in a space where you can be really resilient is to be able to say, hey, I made a mistake. What can we do better next time? And really owning it, knowing that you are not going to be judged for it. Ask for what you need. Ladies, how many of you have fantastic boundaries and really know how to say a big resounding yes to what you need? Learn how to say, no, I absolutely can't do that. Thank you for asking. We are really porous in our boundaries, and we do it because we're generous and we're kind and we want everyone to have a great experience of life. But learning to ask clearly for what you need when you need it, if you can just take this one slide away. This is the thing I see in the women I work with that is the most difficult, and it feels like shame. You can't ask for that. Who am I to ask for that? All these other people need things. But no, when we learn to ask clearly for what we need, when we need it, it really fundamentally changes who we are in the world, and it really changes our resilience. If I could see your hands, I know if I say, show me a display of hands of people who have ever got to the point where they were angry, tired and resentful because they'd said yes to one too many things, and then when they got to doing it, they just had no energy left in the tank. It is such a common thing. So when we ask for what we need to do three things. A, we need to set boundaries. I'm going to start at the bottom of this slide. The boundary piece is really important. Boundaries can be really easily defined as what's okay for me and what's not okay for me. And being able to say, you really can't say a very resounding and enthusiastic yes unless you know how to say a really firm, kind, loving and clear no to things. People will always ask, but being able to really articulate that that is not okay for you, without having to justify it, it's just not okay for you, but here are some other things that you might be able to do, or here are some things you could reprioritize if it's needed, is a really great way to stop yourself going down that slippery slope to exhaustion and a complete lack of resilience. Setting clear boundaries is really great because it really gives people permission to walk up to that line and no further. They know clearly what you need and what you don't need. But when we do the sort of passive aggressive invisible boundary of, yes, I can do that, but really in our hearts we're like, oh, why am I always being asked? I always feel like I'm the one who has to do everything. It's really hard, but I'll do it, don't worry. You know, we have these inner narratives. We all do. I certainly do. And it was a big lesson for me to know when to say no, because, you know, I'm curious and I love helping people and I'm always wanting to get in, you know, boots deep to every situation. But I know when I can't do something, and now I just say no, but ask me again. And if I have time, I'll be able to do it for you maybe next time. Going it alone is not the pathway to being resilient or vulnerable and courageous. So this is a time where we really need to be reaching out to coaches, mentors, friends, beautiful groups like this of supportive people who we can say, hey, I need some help, or hey, I just want to hang out and have a wine with you and have a talk and not feel that I'm so alone and I'm so isolated from anything that's going to help me to get back up on my feet. Brene always says that she's never met a successful, resilient, courageous leader who hasn't worked with a therapist or a coach. And I think that's an interesting insight, because even if we're incredibly capable and smart and empathetic and all the things we need to be, if we're doing that in a bubble without anyone ever there to bounce off or to learn things from, or to just give us some perspective on our blind spots, which if our perspective on life is welded to our heads, and that perspective comes from our gender and our race and our experience and our education and all of the things that give us the way we are in the world, we can't know what it's like to be outside of that. We just can't. So having someone who's external, who we trust, who can give us advice or can just simply listen to us, is often what it is needed to take us to the next level. So if you are feeling stuck, or if you're feeling like you're in a place in your business or in your life where you can't get past some hurdles, absolutely think about whether you need to get someone in to help you do that heavy lifting so you're not going it alone. And, working through the stuff that holds us back, which, as I said in the beginning, it's shame. We all have it. Shame is universal. It's like suffering. It's something that all of us have to deal with. So if we know that shame and trauma are very closely linked, and the majority of it comes from our childhood, it's never too late for us to turn around and go, okay, I'm seeing this pattern play out in my life over and over and over, and it's time to make it stop. It's the most empowering and freeing thing that you can possibly do, and it is the absolute road to being able to be vulnerable. When we have shame, we have armor. When we have armor, we fundamentally cut off our capacity to connect with others. As humans, we've got lots of quirks. One of them is our beautiful reptilian brains that allow us to go into fight, flight, or freeze mode whenever we get emotionally aroused. But the other thing that we have is we are hardwired for connection. We need people around us. We can live in our houses, we can wear fancy clothes, we can do all these things, but we are still fundamentally out on the savannah in tribes, working with each other and having a team around us to help us stay safe. So as we've created these false worlds of being really largely isolated in very small groups, we really need other people. So the minute we put on armor, we can't see each other. All we can see is the facade, and it's very difficult to be vulnerable, which means it's very difficult to be courageous if we're all the time adjusting our armor and trying to make sure that we are that visage that we wanted to be out there in the world. So being able to safely and gently take off our armor, to show who we really are, to know that it's safe to be able to do that, and that's the point from which all courage comes. That's a big ask, and that's not something often that we can do on our own. So coaches, mentors, therapists, counselors, friends, whoever it takes. COVID is often, for many people, given us a chance to really be sitting in silence alone for the first time. We're all so busy, we're all making so much noise that for many people it's been a time to really reflect on a lot of things, and it can bring up a lot of different emotions. It can bring up a lot of stuff that we've neatly packed down tightly in our little compartmentalized worlds that we don't need to deal with. So I lovingly and gently invite you to think about your resilience and think about how you can be more vulnerable and be stronger, and where can you take off your armor, and where can you get to a place in your life where you know that that's okay, and that the only person that you need to worry about judging you is you. I want to talk a little bit about growth mindset because it's really strongly correlated with resilience, but it's also correlated with its partner, which is a fixed mindset. And fixed mindsets are the kind of things which really stop us being able to be agile in the world. So growth mindset comes from a professor in Stanford in the US called Carol Dweck, who did a lot of work with children initially and then has developed this whole idea around growth mindset, which is that the people who have growth mindsets, and it's something that can be learned, it's not something which is innate or that we're born with. People that have growth mindsets are people who are really curious, and they look for difficulty as a learning experience. So she had the experience of working in classrooms with kids and giving them maths problems, and there'd be like a subset of kids who'd be just like, oh, maths. And then be this other little chunk of kids who'd be like, oh, maths problems, I want it to be as hard as possible. I love learning. And she was like, why is this kid like that and that kid like that? So she did a ton of research and found that growth mindset was a state where you really embraced difficulty because you knew it made you grow, and there was no fear in it. You just ran straight into it, and you wanted to seek it out with real vigor. There was a real delight in being able to grow your mind, and again, this idea that your brain is another muscle that will grow, and there's a real appetite for the experience of that. The flip side of that, which is fixed mindset, is where it's really frightening to fail. And so what happens there is that you tend to seek out activities and ways of being in the world where you won't fail, and so you only are able to reach a limit in what you can do, because without failure there is no growth and no learning. Interestingly, where we see this a lot are in people with really incredibly high level skills, But you'll get to a place where you are incredibly skilled and you can't go any further. And then the capacity to not look for failure means that often there's just a spectacular failure. And I think we've seen this in sporting people quite often, where you get to the point where it's something just blows up and the career's over because the pressure of performing and being the best all the time was too much to bear. So what we're not looking for are people who want to be the best, and we're definitely not looking for perfectionism. What we're looking for in a growth mindset is a real interest and appetite in learning and all of the failure that goes with it. And I say in this, seek out difficulty with a non-binary vigor, and I want to unpack that for you because it's possibly quite confusing. I talk about things that are non-binary a lot because we use language very poorly, because we're lazy with the way we use language. So that's why with things like resilience and mindset and meditation, all the things that we talk about all the time, mindfulness, we code them and we pop them away and we think, oh, that sort of means this. But what we do is we really think about things in a very binary way in our lives. We think about things which are good or bad, or, happy or sad. We have really sort of just like a complete split. What we love are the things which are really good, happy, pleasant experiences. What we don't like are the things which are bad, unpleasant, stressful. And so we tend to really compartmentalize where we want to go with them. We just want the good all the time. We don't want to have to deal with the bad. This is really unrealistic, and the fixed mindset that goes to that means that when the bad stuff comes, we're completely unprepared for it. When the good stuff comes, we just want more of it, more of it, more of it, more of it. If we think about things as non-binary, as on a spectrum of experience, and we aren't putting a valorized weighting to the good things are good and the bad things are bad, that they just are, it really allows us to go through experiences which are potentially going to be hard. So when I said before, we all have shame, it's unpleasant to think about, you might want to work with a therapist. I've done shame work in massive rooms of people in our leadership work, and the people that really kind of go, oh, shame, yeah, I know that feels like it's disgusting, I never want to feel that again, but I'm going to lean in now and I'm going to really start investigating it. Now, that's not an experience which most people would run towards. However, it's an experience that fundamentally can change our whole lives when we get rid of a whole lot of the baggage we've been carrying around. So being able to say, okay, that experience and this experience, not good, not bad, just experience, it really means that we can absolutely look for things that we don't even have an inkling of how they're going to turn out, just because we're led by this curiosity. So the other thing I'd really invite you to do today is start thinking about what it is that you are resistant to. Where do you not want to go when emotion comes up, when you're feeling overwhelmed, all the things that make us more resilient? And what would happen if you just stayed there, if you just sat there and felt it and didn't find other ways to be busy or to distract yourself or someone over there to blame or something that wasn't completely controlled by you in your reaction? Getting to a place where you really embrace growth mindset and you don't have the inner voice that says, I can't do that, I've never been any good at maths, I've never been any good at this, oh no, that's just not something I have any skills in. And have a voice that says, well, I haven't actually really tried, or maybe there's a different way to learn this. That's when you start really unlocking resilience, and the vigor and the joy that comes with that is just incredible. So this is what resilience is. We know what it isn't, but what it is being present. And I talked about that earlier. This is a concept that I think is really, we can sort of intellectually understand it. In our actual bodies, it's really different, and it's difficult to understand because so much of our time is spent referencing the past, what happened, telling ourselves the stories about who we are and all the things that we know, and referencing the future, what we want to happen, what we really, really hope will happen. And then we build stories connecting those two things together. Much like connection, storytelling is absolutely hardwired to the human condition. It's our primary way of learning. We think our way of learning is using books and pens and writing. That's a really relatively recent invention. The way we've learnt historically has been through sounds and forming pictures in our minds. That's our primary way of communicating. We see a picture and we attach a word form to it and we can verbally describe it, which is why so many of our original ancient cultures were really steeped in verbal tradition, because we were able to easily hold that information. We've carried that through, even though we're really handy with a pen these days. What we like to do is tell stories. So we'll tell a story about just about anything. And because we've got this brain that's constantly looking to see if there's a lion coming towards us and are we in any kind of danger, we make up a story to give us a thing. So I can look at Belinda and kind of go, oh, Belinda, friend or foe? Is she coming at me with a knife or is she going to make me a cup of tea? In the absence of any actual facts, I'll just make up a story about that. I think she's awesome. She's probably making me a cup of tea. Practically going to be my best friend. I'm safe. Get a nice big serotonin uplift in my brain. I've told myself a story without any facts. That's the thing about our brains. They don't need facts. We really think that they are the smartest things in the world. They are not. They're a really good machine for calculating whether we're frightened or not and storing some information in some semblance of order. But when we're present, I have memories of that. Those memories are fundamentally stories and they're unreliable, and I'm stitching them together in ways that tell the stories I want to tell about what happened. In the future, I'm doing the same thing. I'm creating a picture for myself. I'm filling in all of the details. I'm filling in all of the color. And then I'm saying that's a fact and I'm heading towards that. Now that's all fine unless that fact becomes hard-baked such that when we get there and it's not like that, all of our expectations are completely ruined and we fall in a heap. So being present means that we aren't relying on that or that, what any knowledge of and any fact of. One of the things that we can always control, as I said, is our reaction. The other thing, which is the only thing that we can say for a fact is truth, is our response to something. So the only thing I know is how I feel. I can't say what's happening for someone else. So if I say, well, my business would have been great, but that ruined it for me. That's not really the experience that happened. The experience that happened is that I really felt my business was ruined by a series of events. Nothing was done to me. I can only feel it. It's conceptual, but it is a way of changing the way we're thinking. So we recognize that we are making all of it in our minds, and then we're putting it out into the world as fact. When we're present, we're observing. In meditation and in mindfulness, you hear a lot of discussions about being present and also being an observer. And what that means is that we see ourselves reacting, but rather than sort of diving in and getting into the reaction of it, we are able to recognize that we're hooked by emotion, recognize that we are having all of those experiences that our body is designed to do. And not buy into it, not buy into the story. That's the fakest news you're ever going to come across. But we can say, oh, I see Polly reacting to this in our heads. I can see myself getting emotionally tripped up by this. When have I felt this before? When did that happen? What was the first time I remember that happening? Oh, that was in childhood when I fell off my bike and I was laughed at. Oh, so here I am now, 40 years later, and I'm having the same emotional response in a completely different situation and thinking it's about this moment. So being present allows you to go, what's happening here and what can I do to pull myself out of that next? It just means that we stay with what is. If you can get to that place in your life, you will have the most joyful and fulfilled life possible, because you're only going to be dealing with what's in front of you and you're not going to be constantly in anxiety or in worry about the past and the future. Now, this is a really short session to get into some potentially really big concepts. So I'm going to leave you with that as a top line. But if you want to understand any more about that, again, Brené's books, there's a lot of really beautiful work that's done out there that really talks about becoming resilient and growth mindset and those kind of things. What else resilience is releasing expectations. And that really speaks to that sort of that idea of developing an expectation of what's going to happen and then being really disappointed when it doesn't, without recognizing that we have just created a story and that it's not the fault of anything else because it was just going to happen the way it was going to happen. So being able to really sort of have the loosest grip in the world is the best way to stay really resilient. Not knowing all the answers. This is a really massive one. Often we feel that it is our job to know everything, and I don't mean that in an egotistical way, and I don't mean that in a way that we know it all, but we think we have to solve everything. We have to know what to do. And part of vulnerability and part of courage is sort of saying, I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't know the answer to this, but I'm really willing to stay with the problem and be curious and find out. When we think we are the only ones holding this ship together, we are going down an absolute road to nowhere because we can't possibly know the answers. And by thinking we can, we box ourselves into this idea of fixed mindset. We box ourselves into a place where if we have to do it all, we can't possibly get help from anyone else. It's the most overwhelming thing possible. So being able to just be curious and say, I don't know, the three most powerful words in the English language, and being able to ask for help, referring back to one of our tools, that's really super important because it allows us to be curious and it allows us to understand that there are solutions for things and there are problems that we haven't even considered yet. I think it was Einstein that said if I had an hour, I'd spend 59 minutes on the problem and I'd spend one minute on the solution. We live in a culture where we spend 59 minutes on the solution and 1 minute on talking about how we think we've got a solution. So the action bias is very much linked to our dislike of uncertainty and our dislike of emotional exposure. And oh wait, what? That's the definition of vulnerability. So we're so hardwired to not be vulnerable and to be all armored up and have all the answers. When we can just be curious and courageous and vulnerable, we can work together to recognize that there's no way we can possibly have all of the answers. But we also may be trying to solve the wrong problem. And I think that the longer time we can spend just not trying to tick it off our list, get that fixed, and try and really recognize what it is we're trying to solve, it makes us a lot more resilient because then we become curious, problem seekers, not solvers. And often the way we solve problems is the way we've always solved problems, which means that innovation is not present. Resilience is knowing how to breathe. Who would have thought we'd be talking about breathing in resilience? But breathing is beyond essential in terms of regulating our emotions. I'm just such a bandit for the breath work. I love it so much. I incorporate it into all my work. Any poor rube who strays across my path is just instantly sat down and breathed because mostly because we're in this situation where we're so heightened all the time, and particularly now where everyone's all uptight with COVID, we really shallow breathe. When we breathe into the top of our chest, what happens is we really denude our brain of oxygen. If we don't have oxygen in our brains, we instantly push ourselves into that fight, flight, or freeze, and we don't have an opportunity to settle. So if you want to be present, the best way to do it is by breathing. One of the ways that we can do this is just having a mindfulness to the breath and knowing that we need to breathe through our nose, deeply into our stomachs, and out through our mouths. Cortisol and stress hormones are released on the breath. There's only 2 or 3 ways you can release them, and 70% of our stress is released through our breath, which is shocking because most people don't have that as one of their top fun facts. So when you do a nostril breath in and a mouth breath out, like that, as hot as we can, we're releasing our stress. So if you're in a situation where you're going into a meeting or you're having a difficult conversation with a spouse or a co-worker or a kid, the best thing you can possibly do is take an incredibly deep breath through your nose, hold it, and then breathe it out through your mouth. The other things you can do to relieve stress are what animals do, which is just shake it off. So classically moving and being able to just breathe and move, they're your 2 key ways. So knowing how to breathe is one of the absolute power tools for people who are really resilient, because as soon as we get heightened by emotion and we can breathe ourselves back into a state of rational thinking, it allows us to be able to deal with what's in front of us, not all of the crazy stuff that's going on in our head. So I really encourage you to start paying attention to how you breathe. I was working with a coaching client the other day who was telling me how terribly anxious she was all the time, and I was listening to her speak like this, and I said, how's your breath? And she just went, oh, and realized that she never breathes any deeper than the top of her lungs. And it's true for a lot of us. So by being able to just simply say, okay, well, let's just start breathing. And there's a beautiful 4-part breath practice that's called, it's called box breathing, because if you think of it in a box in your mind, it's 4 counts breath in, hold for 4, 4 counts breath out, hold for 4. It's also called tactical breathing because it's used by the SAS when they go into combat, because that is a situation where if ever you want to have a heightened response to anything and be in fight or flight, that's going to take you there. So 4 breaths, 4 beats in, 4 hold, 4 beats out, 4 hold. It's a really great way. 5 minutes in the morning and 5 minutes at night. I can guarantee you that will change the quality of how you get through each day. And anytime you're in a situation where you're feeling really stressed and you're going into that crash to the ground, breathing, really honoring the breath will bring you back. Breathing through our noses, it activates our parasympathetic nervous system, which is the system that is rest and digest. Breathing through our mouths, which we tend to do when we're frightened or elevated, that activates our sympathetic nervous system, which gets us into fight or flight. So there's a lot of reasons that resilience is very much a felt sense, much more than it's a thought activity. these strategies are all to help you deal with the things that happen in the height of suffering or in the height of crisis or in the height of whatever, to get you back to the place where you can do the bounce. All right, we've got 12 minutes for questions. I'm so ready for them.
Oh, wow, Polly, that was just amazing. And you're right about breathing a lot of the time, just that thing that comes natural to us, we don't focus on well enough, the nurturing that it gives. So really good finishing point there, to make sure that we're all conscious of that place and that nurturing, that just by simply being and breathing it's so important.
If there's just one thing we can do to help ourselves in our lives, it's just breathing. It's so simple. I think I might just change my bio to say breathes. Polly McGee breathes. That's it. That's all we need. Breathes. How did you do that? I breathed.
I was interested, Polly, in your article that you have around gritty faith of surrender and the antidote to fear and anxiety. Can you briefly make some comment about that and then I'll refer to a couple of questions that have come through.
Sure, Belinda. So that's a quote that is from a guy called General Stockdale. So he was interned in a prisoner of war camp, and so he was asked when he was interviewed one day, who were the people that survived being in a prisoner of war camp? And you really can't get much more need for resilience than being interned in that sort of world. And he said that people that survived were the people that had gritty faith and gritty facts. And what he meant by that was that the people that believed they were going to be out by Christmas time, and then Christmas time would roll around and they'd still be in there, and the people that believed they'd be out by Easter and they wouldn't get through. He was asked, well, what happened to those people? And he said, well, those people, they died of a broken heart. And so the interviewer said, well, who were the people that survived? And he said, the people that survived were the ones that just got through to the end of every day, which is, it's again, an invitation to presence. And so gritty faith and gritty facts is very much about, do you have enough information to freak out? I mean, this is the basic question when we're dealing with stress and what's going on, that we actually know is real. Do we have enough information to freak out? What will freaking out achieve? And so it's asking us not just to have a blind faith, everything's going to be all right. We want to be optimistic, but we want to have the gritty faith with the gritty facts. We can know things are tough, but when we have the perspective that they're tough, but they will pass and we'll move through this, or we'll adapt, or we'll find ways to survive. The number of stories of incredible survival that have come from people who have adopted that way of getting through, it really invites us to take that on. So it's being able to move through the world with optimism that isn't unrealistic, and with a capacity to just see what's ahead of you without pinning all your hopes to this future thing, and then when it happens, there's no recovery from it.
No, thanks for that, Polly. A question that came through Brené's book. What's the title of that, please?
So Brené has a number of books. The one that I am trained in to facilitate is called Dare to Lead, and that's very much brings together a lot of her body of work. So she started her life as a researcher looking at vulnerability and shame, basically. She wanted to start a global conversation on those things because they're so infrequently talked about. If you haven't had any experience of Brené's work, she did a legendary TED Talk which kind of catapulted her into where she is now on vulnerability, which you'll find it's had something like 50 million views. It's crazy. But there's also a beautiful Netflix special called The Call to Courage, which really outlines this if it's easier just to pop your eyes onto something rather than to read. But Dare to Lead is very much about how do we work systematically through vulnerability, shame, courage and resilience, and how do we bounce back. She has a couple of other books though that I think are really beautiful, and one of them is called Braving the Wilderness, and this is very much a book about how do we do things when to live into our values and to really execute who we are in the world. We often find that we feel really isolated and alone, and I think that's an experience I see many women leaders finding themselves in, where they really want to stand up for what they believe in. They don't want to just go with the herd, and yet it gets kind of lonely out there just with the sound of crickets all around you. So that book's very much about what is belonging in the sense of leadership. And then there's another one which I think is called Rising Strong. Of course, it's called Rising Strong, which is about resilience and is a really interesting, sort of Brené's take on how to be more resilient. So she's really given us a lot in this body of work around how do we be stronger while we continue to be soft and heart-centered and connected and not just have to be a parody of sort of, an armoured up dude, which I think has often been the way that leadership has been asked of us previously. But those times have changed and we aren't leading like that anymore. And if ever there's a time for women to rise up in what are our core strengths of connection and nurturing and community and leadership, now is that time, Belinda.
Thanks for that. Question that's come through is around resilience and the ability for self-reflection. Can you recommend some tools based on what we've talked about today to lead people through this process, particularly looking at self-reflection?
Yeah, self-reflection, it's a really beautiful question. Self-reflection is very much about being present. And that's when I talked about sitting in the discomfort. It is giving yourself a discipline and a practice of a place and time every day. So we could call this meditation, we could just call it being present or reflecting, where you sit down and you look with kind eyes across what you've done, what you would have liked to have done differently, what you can really celebrate and bank those wins. So I would say in terms of a tool set, one of the things that has been most beneficial for me across the last 10 years of my life, and certainly in the last 5, is a very dedicated meditation practice. And every single morning I meditate, I'm reflective, I have gratitude for what I do. Gratitude is a huge part of resilience, and there's a lot of data now on how gratitude makes people able to be much more able to cope with things, because we really are recognizing what is going well. So reflection is not about making a laundry list of all the things you're really deeply shit at and how you could have done stuff better. It's about looking for patterns, looking for the things that you see yourself get tripped up by over and over again, and then having the courage and vulnerability to go more deeply into investigating those things. If you've never looked into that part of your life, and many of us don't do that, that is the work that will transform you. And it's reflective work, and it can be difficult work. So the key tools I would say are journaling, just writing for 10 minutes a day, not even thinking about what you're writing, just putting some words down, letting yourself express unedited, not looking back and being critical. Meditating in terms of sitting in reflective thought. How was the day? What did I do? What would I like to have done differently? What do I commit to doing tomorrow? And gratitude. What am I grateful for every single day? And really feeling into that. And probably the fourth thing that I think is incredibly valuable when we're talking about these things, which are fundamentally a felt sense, is that we feel them in our body and we get to know the very subtle language of our body. And Belinda, you talked about the sort of the unconsciousness of breath. We just sort of see our bodies as vehicles to move around on. What we don't see is that they are giving us information all the time. It's not coming out of our brains, it's coming out of our felt sense. So when we are in situations where we are feeling things and feeling emotions, we'll generally feel them in some part of our body. Our throats will get tight, we'll feel sick, or our chests will feel heavy, or we'll have a response. When we can see them and feel them, they happen before the thoughts happen. So the minute we can be in a dialogue with our bodies around felt sense, we get much more accurate information as to what's going on for us. So I recognize in that reflective sit down or lie down of meditation, you're also thinking about, what am I feeling? Where am I feeling it? Where am I holding something from the day? Where does it feel in my body? And then just breathing into that. Again, that's a whole other practice, but it's a beautiful practice that can be done quickly. This isn't about, I don't have time to do this. We're talking 5 to 10 minutes. So when everyone says to me, oh, I've never got time to meditate, I'm far too busy. It's like, yeah, that's the problem. 10 minutes, that's all you need.
Wise words, Polly. We've got time for one last question.
Yeah, absolutely.
In identifying staff, friends and colleagues who appear to lack resilience, what is a soft way to start them down the journey of embracing the journey towards resilience?
It's really just about being present in an empathetic way. You've also got to remember that where you see someone lacking resilience, you're telling yourself a story about their behavior and you're not seeing what's going on inside for them. And they might be, so we can't ever assume what's happening for someone else. But it's really just asking the question, how are you going? And stopping to listen, not the, hi, how are you? And you're out the door. It's the, hi, how are you? And then staying with them. And that you might have to do that 20 times before the one time that the person goes, actually, I'm having a really shit time. And then your response can be, would you like to talk about it? What does support look like for me? Not advising, not fixing. Critically important because, again, remember what I said about action bias. This is not to rush into and go, don't worry, I've got a solution, I can fix this. What it is just saying, yeah, I hear that. Oh, that sounds really awful. Tell me more. Tell me more about how you're feeling. What does support look like? It's really allowing the person to just be vulnerable and expose what's happening for them. That in and of itself can make them really strong. If they say to you, I would love advice on this, then you've got a license to be able to say, okay, this is what I think. But just remember, the key thing we can do with each other is be connected and non-judgmental. And whatever's happening for that person is safe with you, it's private with you, it's not shared with other people, particularly in the work context. And we cover off a lot of this stuff in that Dare to Lead work, and that book will be really helpful for that. But it's really just what would we want someone to do for us? Be there, listen, really genuinely feel it, and circle back. It's not so much in the asking, it's in the coming back and just checking in. Are you okay? To the point at which that person really gets that you're not going away. Not in a way that's weird or bullying or might get an ABO taken out on you. It's just in a way that's like, I'm here for you and I'm staying here. Because lots of us are armoured to the teeth and it's very, very difficult for us to take that armour down and become vulnerable. So if you don't get the response you think you want the first time, just keep on going back. Keep on being kind and loving, leading with your heart.
Oh, thanks, Polly. Look, I'm sure, like me, participants today have really enjoyed your wise words, and it certainly, for me, made me more aware of the importance of breathing, and also just reflecting on what you've had to say, the gratitude to be part of the conversation and being able to listen to some of the tools that you've imparted to us that we can use to build that resilience. Very powerful words, very powerful tools that I think we can all embrace in different ways to instill in us opportunities for the future. So thank you very much for making us not be afraid of failure, to have the opportunity to learn the lessons out of that. And I'm sure that our paths will cross again. And thank you again.
I hope so, Belinda. Thank you so much for hosting this in such an elegant and beautiful way. And the one thing I'll leave you guys with is just to remember the key thing is that we're all doing the best we can all the time. That's all we need to know, and we can be really grateful for that. But I'm really grateful for you giving me an hour of your time today, and thank you so much for asking me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Polly.